So did you know from the very beginning that you were always going to be in wine, or were there times when you wanted to, become a lawyer or a politician or something?
In my mid-teens, I had no intention to be in the wine business at all. One of the great things that we've got here at Penley is that we are 5 generations. My daughter's now working for us 6 generations. That we're very passionate about what we do. We have that long family history. But when you're a 16-year-old and your father's a winemaker and his father's a winemaker and his father's a winemaker and your mother's father's a winemaker, it's something you don't really want to do. But when at the age of 18 I started working for Mum's company, Penfolds, up here at McGill, Grange Vineyard. Started working with Max Schubert, and I ended up working for Penfolds for 17 years. 3 of them only when it was owned by the family, and then 14 when it was owned by various corporations. And as I explained to a lot of people, this is where I learnt my trade as a winemaker. And is this where I got my passion? Not necessarily. I enjoyed the business. It was great training, it was a great job, great people. It's a wonderful industry. But it really wasn't until 1988 when I started Penley that I really discovered the creativity and the passion about winemaking. And that comes about through the experience I gained, obviously, at Penfolds, but also when you're making it yourself. And you're responsible, the buck stops with you, you find out a whole lot of stuff about you.
Working on an iconic wine like the Grange, how has that influenced you?
Well, as I said, when I started working at Penfolds, and I started at the Penfolds Grange Vineyard, Max Schubert, one of the most famous winemakers in Australia, was still the chief winemaker. So I moved into a winery that I'd grown up in, but then I came into this winery as a worker, to work in the laboratory first, involved with the winemakers, particularly Max Schubert. So what I saw in the vineyard in my first 4 or 5 years was a real mixture of the modern way of doing things, because we're talking now about 1973, but also we saw a lot of the ways that wine was made in the past, particularly red wine. Max Schubert had worked from 1953 on red wine production, as opposed to what Penfolds were actually known for was port, but he started working on red wine production in terms of a different way of doing things, and I saw that. And that was really getting your hands dirty, seeing it from the source, and that was an amazing sense of experience. But I also got involved in a whole lot of other things as I went through the business, and I was there for 17 years. And so I got to learn about making sparkling wine, I got to learn about making port, I made cheap white wine, expensive white wine, cheap red wine. So you are gaining a whole lot of spread. But for me, the most important was that gaining experience from some of the old timers. Max Schubert was 10 years off retirement, but even more important, in the winery here at McGill, there were wine guys, in the cellar, who'd been there for 40, 50 years. And these guys had stories to tell. They were having a bit of fun with me a lot of the time, but there were a lot of stories to be told about why they were there. They used to talk about my family, They said, Kym, I went to the Second World War and your grandfather told me if I came back I had a lifetime job. And they did. And that experience of personal things, personal experiences, but also seeing how it was done in a very hands-on way, which McGill still was in 1973.